My name is Seth Gehle, and this is my story of overcoming a childhood of trauma, neglect, and sexual abuse. I was born and raised in a small town in Ohio, northwest Ohio, called Lima. It's right on 75, about an hour south of Toledo. And I had a pretty tough childhood. I was born back in 94, and about a year or two into my childhood, my father almost kills my mother. So they got into a fight. To this day, it's a he said, she said. I don't really know what happened or the truth behind all of it. But my father ends up stabbing my mom behind the ear and nearly kills her. So I grew up without a father, basically. I don't have any memories or I just don't remember anything about my father in my childhood for a long time, anyways. Due to the circumstances, my mom was a single mother raising me and my two sisters. And we often bounced around house to house. We moved, once or twice a year, every single year. I was always bouncing around different schools. And it was just really tough growing up like that with a single mother and no real man or father in my life. My mom had a lot of different boyfriends. She would date different guys. And she would oftentimes talk about how toxic or abusive their relationship was between the two of them. She would almost in a way of like bragging to me and my sisters talk about how she would get into a fight or they would throw a punch or she would throw dishes at them and we would come home and there was holes in the walls and just a very violent and toxic childhood and environment and household that I lived in, that I grew up in. I can remember my earliest memories. I can remember being like 5 years old and being in kindergarten. And I was kind of a troublemaker, but I was also a really good student. I was a perfect straight A student. But my earliest memories would be coming home and living in this apartment complex and just going to different babysitters' houses. And one of the babysitters that I frequented, or that we would go to often, they had a bunch of boys. There was like 4 or 5 boys that lived there. And out of those 4 or 5 boys, one of the older ones, who was a teenager, he was maybe 16, 15, 16 years old. One night he eventually pulls me up into his bunk and he began to molest me when I was about 5 years old. I don't remember how old that kid was. I just know that he looked like a grown man and I did not. I just vividly remember like the distinct differences between the two of us. And so he molested me. It was mostly just like him exposing himself to me and then me exposing myself to him and then kind of a little bit of touching here and there. It wasn't anything extreme in regards to like sexual abuse or molestation goes, but it happened and I did report him. I ended up telling my grandparents about him shortly thereafter, and my grandparents approached that family, that babysitter's family, and kind of said like, hey, here's the situation, here's what we think happened, and they denied everything. And that's pretty typical in those situations. And so it was denied and we were still sent back to that house to be babysat, even though those things were kind of brought forward. I don't remember that particular abuse or molestation continuing with that kid. I think it did stop when I reported him, but that happened, and it is what it is. And we kind of moved on and kept living, doing our thing. Throughout the years, well, excuse me. So at that same time, at 5 years old, I was also introduced to porn. My mom, she would work all day long, and so she'd be gone. Me and my sisters would get home from school, and my mom would be gone. So she wouldn't get home until 5, 6, 7 o'clock at night, and then she'd cook us dinner. We'd go to bed, wake up, go to school, do the whole thing over again. But during this time, while she was gone during the day, my sisters and I would, we'd run around the neighborhood with our friends and we'd get into things. And unfortunately, part of that was also in our own house. My mom had a porn collection, and we ended up finding the porn collection, and then we were watching these VHS porn tapes, full length tapes, videos, watching everything front to back. And you can imagine how like captivating or compelling that might be to a child. So we started getting into all that, and my mom found out we were watching it, because we were taking it out. We would take it out in the neighborhood and show the neighborhood kids. We just thought that it was funny, whatever, not realizing the damage that it was doing to us, but also to other kids. At that same time, I even attempted to recreate some of those scenes with a girl that lived in our neighborhood. She was my age, she was 5, 6 years old, and I attempted to basically recreate what I had seen on those tapes with her out of curiosity and a misunderstanding of like what relationships meant or were. So at 5 or 6 years old, because of the porn and likely because of being molested as well, I had already began to look at girls in a different light, as they were these sexual objects or some piece of like a transaction of some sort. I was looking at girls in a sexual way where you would think a 5, 6, 7-year-old would never do that, and unfortunately I was. As the years would go on, between 5, 6, 7 years old, we continued to bounce around a lot. We moved around a lot. One of the places that we lived frequently would be with an aunt and an uncle, and we would move in with them. We'd live with them for a few months, and then we'd move out, and then we'd go back and move out. So it was just this constant back and forth. But during the times that we lived with them, I always thought that they were very strange. They were very weird, just like did weird things, weird behaviors. They were a part of the local church. They were very involved in the church, so they went to church every Sunday. We'd have to go to the church with them, and we were kind of part of the church too. And we started, singing the songs and hanging out with all the kids and doing the things. But at home, especially on the weekends, my aunt would intentionally like expose herself to me and my sisters, but I don't, I know she was certainly doing it to me. And she would come downstairs and she would be completely naked, and she would walk around the house completely naked and intentionally like walking past me or in front of me or near me in the mornings. Usually when it would happen. And it was just strange. It was just weird that she would expose herself to me in that way. And they were like creepy people in general. And so, yeah, it was just like a weird environment to be in. They never did anything towards me specifically. They never like touched me or nothing like that. But it was just like these weird behaviors that they were doing. And it almost seems like they were trying, or she was trying to like set me up or groom me in a way to like think that it was normal or whatever, right? So, anyways, when I was about 7 or 8 years old, we were still with my mom, and we're living on our own. We're living in this house for a while, and my mom had asked us if we wanted to go see our dad. And to me, at 7 or 8 years old, this was like my first time getting to go meet my father. I have pictures of me and him from when I was a baby, but I have no memories of him. I have no memories of playing or being out in the front yard or throwing the football or nothing. Like I don't have any of those things. And so when she had said that we were going to go see my dad, like this was, to me, this was my opportunity to get to meet him really. And this is my first memory of my father. Like if I think about my father, this is the earliest thing that I can think of, and my first encounter with him. And it was he was in prison or jail. And so my mom takes us down to the local like prison or jail. And I was kind of excited because I was going to go see my father, and this was like a big deal for me. And so we go down there, and I remember walking in, and there's all these cubicles lined up on the right side of the room, and there's plexiglass in between, us and the inmates, and there's a black phone on the wall in each cubicle. And we go down and we sit down in our little spot, and my dad comes in the room with everybody else. And I don't know how I noticed my dad or how I knew who he was, but I knew who he was as soon as I saw him. And he sits down. I pick up the phone and I try to talk to him, and I couldn't talk. I just start crying, and I'm crying and I'm crying. Just can't control myself. And I was so sad and heartbroken that this was my father. I couldn't hang out with him. I couldn't like leave the place with him, and I didn't know when I was going to get to see him again. And so it was just like all these like wave of emotions had come over me, and I was just crying about everything that was going on. And my sisters talked to him on the phone a little bit, but I kind of just I just couldn't stop crying, so I didn't really get to talk to him. After 20 or 30 minutes, we kind of pack up our stuff and we leave. And my father would shortly after that, he would get out of prison or jail, and I would see him very sparingly, like once a year maybe, or twice a year from that point forward. Every now and then, it would be like a random weekend. We'd go to like see our dad for a couple hours or something like that. It was just very strange, like random and sparingly. And so around that same age, 8, 9, 10 years old, my mother began to get very abusive suddenly. Like she had always smoked and drank. She always smoked a lot and liked cigarettes and smoked a lot of weed. And this was like 20 years ago when weed was like a bad drug, right? So she always smoked a lot and she drank a lot. And we always had people at our house smoking and drinking too. Our house was always the place that people would go to hang out and drink and smoke. And not real sure why, but it was just the hangout spot, I guess. And I can remember coming home around 9, 10 years old and coming home from school, going upstairs. I remember looking into my living room and seeing my mother in there with 8, 9 other guys, like smoking and passing a blunt around the room. And my older sister was in there as well, and she wouldn't have been older than 11 years old at the time, 11 or 12 years old at the time. And I remember seeing her in there smoking with them and just thinking to myself, like, I will never live that life. I'll never be that person. I don't ever want to do drugs. I don't ever want to drink. I don't ever want to do any of this. I had these big dreams of doing something with my life. I wasn't really sure what it was going to be yet, but I just had big dreams. I mean, I wanted to play football. I wanted to play football for Ohio State. I knew that I wanted to go to college. I knew that I wanted to like just do something really cool with my life. I didn't know what it was going to be yet, but I knew that I wasn't going to go down this path of drugs and alcohol. And during that time, I don't know if it was the stress and the pressure of just being a single mother, 3 kids, or what, I don't know what it was, or just life in general. But my mom would slowly become more violent and abusive, and she had always been a disciplinarian parent. Like she'd always given us whoopings, which I didn't really, I don't think those things were abusive in any way, but she'd always whooped us. She was always very hard on us, but she had to be because she was a single parent. She's a single mother. So me and my sisters, we had to behave very well so that we could get by and do the right thing. So I don't think that she was this inherently like bad person. I think over time it just weighed on her. And she, at this time, around 9, 10 years old, she really began to like kind of snap in different ways. I can remember being and we had this SUV. I think it was an Explorer, Ford Explorer. I can remember being in the back seat with my sisters, and my mom is driving. Her boyfriend's in the passenger seat, and we were going down this inner city road, a 25-mile-an-hour zone, and my mother was doing somewhere around 45, 55, 60 miles an hour, just flying down this street in a neighborhood. And she was drunk and possibly high, but she was just in this rage, this angry rage, and she's yelling at everybody in the car, and she's screaming and saying verbatim, "I'm going to kill us all. Like, I'm going to fucking kill everybody. I'm going to kill us all." And she's yelling at her boyfriend, and me and my sisters were in the back seat, and we're screaming and crying, and we're begging her to stop and slow down, and like, "Please, mom," like, "No." And she turns around and yells at us and tells us to shut the fuck up. And this was one of the more terrifying moments of my childhood, especially with my mother. That was really scary, just being in the back of that car, not understanding what was going to go, why it was happening, and then like what was going to happen. Like if she would have gotten into a wreck or drove into another car, or we didn't know what was happening. And she eventually slows down, and I don't remember what happens after that. It was such a traumatic moment for us. During that same time as well, we lived in this house in this neighborhood that wasn't the best neighborhood to live in. It wasn't a horrible place, but it wasn't the best. And my mom, at this point, when we were about 10 years old, because me and my sisters were all 1 year apart, so we're like 9, 10, 11, 10, 11, 12. So around that time, my mom would work at night and be home during the day. So while we were at school, my mom was at home. And then when we would come home, she would go to work. So it was kind of like this weird, I don't know why she chose those hours, but nonetheless, we would come home, in about 6, 7, 8 o'clock at night or so, she would go to work. It was usually like 7 or 8 o'clock at night. She would go to work. And so my sisters and I would just go to bed on our own, whatever, and then just go to sleep, wake up the next day and get ready for school. And in this house we lived in, there was one night she leaves, she goes to work, I go to bed, my sisters wake me up shortly after, and my older sister has a knife in her hand, and my younger sister has an alarm clock. She has the cord wrapped around her hand, and the alarm clock's hanging from it. And she says, both of them tell me somebody's trying to break in. And I didn't believe them at first, but I saw that they were holding a knife and an alarm clock, and so I was like, okay, maybe this is serious. And so I remember going downstairs and looking into the kitchen, and our back door had a 2x4 across the door nailed into the frame, as well as the deadbolt lock and the handle. And so I remember sitting there watching it from the kitchen entrance, like watching the back door, and there's 3 guys out there. One of them had a shovel, one of them had like a baseball bat, and the other one had some other sort of blunt object. I can't remember what it was, but I just remember like hearing the 3 strikes in a row, like the boom, 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 and they're trying to break in this door, and you could see the nails and the trim from the door like splitting away from the wall. They're hitting this door, and the 2x4 is getting ripped out of the wall, and you can just see it all like right there, just like opening up. And after what seemed like 5 or 10 minutes, they just stop and they run away. Supposedly, my neighbors had come out and kind of scared them away, and then my neighbors called the cops. The cops showed up, and they called my mom home from work. My mom comes home. There's a little bit of conversation. I don't really remember much other than the fact that they're just like, okay, like go back inside, go to sleep. And so we go back inside and we go to sleep. And we wake up the next day and we go to school like nothing happened. We never saw any therapists. We never talked to anybody. There was no follow-up, like, is everything okay? We just showed up to school the next day and just kept it moving. The same thing happens a couple weeks later. All I remember from that one is waking up in my neighbor's arms. My neighbor was in our house, or came into our house and grabbed me and picked me up, and I was in his arms, and he's running through my hallway. And I just remember waking up in the guy's arms, and all he was saying was like, hey, don't worry, I got you. Somebody tried to break in again. And same thing happened. Mom comes home from work, they call the cops show up, and the cops are like, yep, this thing's happened. Go back inside and go to sleep, And, I don't know if, I'm not blaming the police in that situation, to be clear. I'm sure there's a little bit of everybody who has a little bit of blame to take in that place, especially, my mother. She should have advocated for something. But the thing is ever since I was a child, ever since I was really young, my mom would always tell us what happens in our house stays in our house. And so, like in moments like this, the more, if we would talk, my mom would tell us, like, if you tell anybody what's going on, or what we do, or how we live our lives, or what goes on in our house, they're going to come and take you away from us, or they're going to come and take you away from me. And so out of an effort of me and my sisters to protect my mother and not get taken away from her, we would just never say anything. So around this time too, like Child Protective Services and all those people, they would come and interview us at school. They would talk to me and my sisters at school, and they'd ask us, hey, what's going on? And we would just constantly tell them, hey, what happens in our house stays in our house. It's none of your business. We're not saying anything. We're not telling on my mom, because my mom was growing weed. She was smoking weed. She was drinking all the time. There's all these things happening at home. And so she would always, that's just the rule that we lived by. What happens here stays here, and that's it, period. So around that time, like I said, my mother, that's when she became more physically violent and abusive towards us. She'd always given us whoopings, but now she was starting to get more physical with us. And she would grab us by our faces a lot of times. She had these long nails. She'd grab us by our faces and yell at us and like slam our heads into the walls. I had long hair down to my shoulders, and so she would pull me by my hair a lot. She'd grab me by my hair and yell at me. I can remember what it feels like with like her having a fistful of my hair and yelling and screaming at me in my face, or grabbing my face and slamming my head against the wall behind me. But there's one day in particular that stands out. I was in my bedroom playing video games, and I was sitting on my bed looking at the TV in front of me, playing the video game, and my back's against the wall behind me, and my sister walks in, and there's another wall right here to my left, and my sister's sitting with her back against that wall, and she's looking at me, and she's kind of talking to me because her and my younger sister had just gotten into a fight, which was pretty typical, but they had just gotten into a fight, and so she's in there talking to me about the whole situation, and I can hear my other sister in the other room crying. And then as I'm sitting here playing games, out of nowhere, my door's right here. My mom kicks open my door, and she walks in, looks at my sister to my left, and just takes her fist and hammer fist style, just like strikes my sister in the face 3 or 4 times, maybe more than that. And as soon as she punches her, my sister's head snaps back, bounces off the wall, and my mom is just sitting here like punching my sister in the face repeatedly. Um, and when this happened, I jumped on the other side of my bed, and I'm like crouched behind my bed, and I'm looking up at this happening because I can't believe like what I'm seeing. I think this was the first time that I had seen my mother like close hand strike one of us. And I'm crouched down behind my bed, and I'm crying and I'm screaming, and I'm just silently in my head just like begging her to stop. And my mother looks at me and says, "Stop fucking crying and being a bitch before I give you something to cry about." And so, I kind of stopped crying, and I kind of quiet down a little bit. My mom yells at us, yells at my sister, and walks out of the room. She never apologizes. She never comes back in and tells us that she loves us. There was no empathy or compassion. There was nothing. There was no love for anything that had just happened. She just walked in, beat the shit out of my sister, yells at me, and then walks out of the room. And this would just continue to happen and get worse and worse. Every time we'd get in trouble, this would happen. Like something crazy like this would happen. A couple weeks later, I was with my cousins walking home from school. I wasn't supposed to walk home from school. I rode the bus every day, so I always got home at the same time. But on this day in particular, me and my cousins, just on our own accord, decided to walk home. And boys being boys, we were kind of running around, getting into things, messing around, taking our time getting home. I get home pretty late, and my mom, instead of being scared or worried that like where I was at, I had gone missing or something was wrong, my mom just yells and screams at me, and she is yelling at me about like where I have been, right? And so she tells me, "Go upstairs, you're getting your ass whooped." And I didn't think anything of this. I'm kind of just going upstairs to get a typical butt whooping. So I go into her room, I bend over the bed, and I'm hanging onto the blankets. And my mom comes inside the room, grabs her paddle. She had this big wooden paddle, solid wood, and had a handle carved in it with some holes drilled into it. And it was just designed for whipping children, basically. So I'm laying there on the mattress, or I'm standing up, and I'm laid out across her bed, hanging onto the sheets, or hanging onto the blankets. And my mom walks in and starts whooping me. And the first strike that she hits me with, I know that this one is a little bit different. Like this one's going to be more intense. And so the first strike she hits me with, I bounce off her bed, and I'm thinking to myself like, okay, this is not good. I fell to my knees, and she proceeds to strike me over and over and over again. Hits me maybe 4 or 5 times across my back, and just beats me down with this piece of wood. And I'm laying there on her floor, and I'm just screaming and crying and just begging her basically to stop and to love me. I'm just like heartbroken for what she had just done to me. And instead of apologizing and loving me and showing some empathy or compassion, she tells me to get the fuck out of my room. So I crawl out of her room, and I crawl to my room, and I lay on my bedroom floor, and I cried for hours, just wishing that she would come and love me or hug me or hold me or take care of me or protect me. Like one of those things would happen, and nothing ever happened. Around that time, I began to have some suicidal ideation. So at 10 years old, I began to think and dream and just obsess with this idea of suicide, whether it was cutting myself, jumping from a height, drowning myself, suffocating myself. I would begin to fantasize about these ways to take my own life. And truth be told, I was scared of feeling pain, and that's probably the biggest reason I never did anything at such a young age. I would oftentimes sit outside my window at night and I would just look at the pavement below in our driveway, and I would just think to myself, like, if I fall, just right, I'll fall and break my neck and this will all be over with. Like, I'll die and this will all be over with. And I never did it. Obviously, I never attempted it. I just kind of kept hanging on to life. I kept hanging on to life. And so, due to the circumstances of my home being in a broken home and the violence and the drugs and everything that was going on, at that time I had found this kid down the street. I found this older friend of mine. His name was, to protect his identity, I'll call him Jacob in this story. But I ended up finding Jacob, and he's like 15 years old. I was 10 years old. Jacob was like 15. And I'd always found myself hanging out with older kids or bigger kids because I was such a small kid. I got bullied a lot, and so I just made friends with all these big kids who could protect me. And I meet Jacob and start hanging out with him. And Jacob knows that I've got this like jacked up home life. Jacob knows that something is wrong, and so he just kind of takes me under his wing and just lets me hang out with him, play video games, eat pizza, just do the thing with him. After maybe 2 or 3 months of hanging out with Jacob, I'm over at his house one day, and this man walks in the front door, and he introduced himself to me. He says, hi, my name is Mondo, and he's this real big guy. He's like 6'5", 6'6", he's 380 pounds. He's got long black hair. It's like slicked back. He's got big aviator style glasses on. Big, very, very big guy. He looked like a left tackle, and he didn't look sloppy, even though he was so big. He looked like he could throw a hard punch. Like, he looked very capable. And he walks in and, he introduces himself. He says, hey, my name is Mondo. And I'm like, well, my name's Seth. And he says, oh, well, do you like football? I'm like, yeah, I love football. And he says, well, do you like video games? I love video games. And he says, well, do you like pizza? I'm like, yeah, I love pizza. He's like, well, why don't you come up to my house with me and Jacob, and we'll hang out and play video games and eat pizza and stuff like that. And so I'm like, all right, sick. Let me go home and ask my mom. So I go home and ask my mom. My mom says, as long as I'm with my friend Jacob, I'm good to go. Because she knows the man. He's a grown man. He's like 30, 31 at the time. So I go back to Jacob's house, and we're good to go. So I get in Mondo's car. He drove this white Honda Civic. It was trash all over the inside of the car, but I didn't really care. I mean, I just remember it being just trash everywhere, all over his car. Like when you put your feet down, it was just like a bed of trash. So Mondo takes us up to, well, on the way to his house, he takes us by this chicken place in our hometown, and we get chicken, and I get a bunch of sides, I get a large drink, whatever, large sides and all this stuff. And I had never gotten this before, so I thought it was really cool that this guy was able to, one, to drive, but then two, was like buying us all this food, and we could get whatever we wanted. It was just awesome. Like, I wasn't used to any of that, being the way that I grew up. And so we get on the highway, we're driving up to Bluffton, Ohio, we're listening to AC/DC and Metallica, and we're just kind of like jamming out in the car. The AC's like full blast, it's nice and cold. And I just think to myself, like, man, this is like awesome, because, maybe things are going to turn around, maybe things are going to start getting better. And we get up to his house, and he lives in this one bedroom, this like one big studio apartment. So you walk in, and the first thing I noticed was it was very dark, but there was just trash everywhere. It was dark, trash, like dirty, and cold. I walk in, turn to my right, and there's an entertainment center with 2 or 3 TVs, couch, couple game systems. There is a computer in the back. There's 2 desktop computers in the back, kitchen, bathroom, all that stuff is in the back right corner. The back left corner had these wooden panels that kind of cornered off where his bed was at. And there were some black sheets and stuff that hung around it as well to kind of like conceal his bed. And so the first thing I like pick up on is that there's multiple TVs and there's multiple game systems, which means we don't have to take turns. And so we sit down and we start playing video games, and we play video games all night long. Whole night goes by. He orders pizza at night. We're drinking pop and eating pizza, and we could just do whatever we wanted. There was no rules. This was awesome. It was just me and my buddies just playing games, eating pizza, and drinking pop, and it was like the best time ever. It was just the best weekend of my life, basically. It was awesome because you go to your friend's house and they have parents, and their parents have rules, and you can't eat all the chips and you can't drink all the pop, and so up at Mondo's house, everything was just, there was no rules, so it was a lot of fun. And Sunday rolls around, and Mondo takes us home, and he says to me, when do you want to come back? He's like, I hope you had fun. When do you want to come back? And I said, well, I'll come back next weekend. I'll come back. I'll keep coming back. Like, it don't matter to me. And he's like, all right, well, I'll come pick you up Friday after school. And so I said, okay. And from that point forward, I began to go to Mondo's house every single weekend, almost every single weekend of the year. I was going to his house like quite literally 45 to close to 50 weekends out of the year. And at that same time, my mom had met a new guy. She had a new boyfriend, and with the new boyfriend, we ended up moving into this other house. And so we leave the house that we were currently in. We go to this other house to move in, and on the day that we were moving in, there was no utilities, so we didn't have power, we didn't have heat or nothing like that. And which this was like common for us. This would happen often where my mom couldn't pay the bills, and so we wouldn't have power for, I don't know, a few days at a time or a week at a time, or we didn't have heat for a week or two. And it wasn't really that bad, truthfully, in the grand scheme of things. Like, we could get by. We just, boiled the water or did whatever to make things work. Or we go to somebody else's house to take a bath or whatever. Like, we made it work, and it wasn't really that bad. But what made this move in particular so challenging, I guess, was I go up to my bedroom, and I always got the smaller bedroom because I was by myself. My sisters always shared a bedroom. And I go upstairs, and I go to my bedroom, and there is hardwood floors, but they're all cracked, splintered, and buckled all the way across the room. And they do that when they're exposed to weather. So the reason why my flooring was like that was there was a hole in my ceiling that was about 3 or 4 feet wide and about 3 or 4 feet deep in my bedroom ceiling, and it was completely exposed to the attic above. There was no drywall, no insulation, like nothing. You could just see straight into the attic above. And so there was nothing to protect my room from the outside elements, really. So, I mean, when it would snow and rain, the liquid or the water, the rain and all that would come straight into my bedroom. And at this moment, this was like the first time that I really began to question my life, like with my mother, and question my mother's actions. I had always, no matter what happened prior to this time, I'd always looked at my mom like she was my mother. She was my protector. She was everything to me. So like, you just feel like you would never turn your back on your mom or your dad no matter what they do. And at this point, I started to question them, question my mother specifically, just because of the nature of the situation. Because I was in that room, my sisters were in a completely fine room down the hall, and then my mom slept down in the living room where it was nice and warm. Like, in fact, probably the most warm place in the home. And during that time, so that boyfriend that she had met that got us in that house and moved us into that house, he eventually gets her addicted to crack and cocaine. So not only was my mother now just like smoking and drinking and getting more physically and verbally and emotionally abusive, she was also addicted to crack and cocaine. So this introduces a whole nother like level of craziness or trauma into our home, where we would have addicts come in our house every single day, 5, 10, 15 people every single day would come in the front door. They'd walk to the back of the house where the bathroom was, and they would all sit in the bathroom and get high all day long. And I mean, they'd be in there for 5, 6, 7, 8 hours a day just getting high in the bathroom. And it was just the craziest thing to me. I don't know. I can remember coming home and being at the house at 9, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night and seeing people passed out in our living room, seeing people passed out in chairs or on the couch, and they're just completely high, and they're shaking and convulsing, and their eyes are rolling back, and their arms are shaking and twitching, and they're just like motionless, like zombies. Like, it was just, I just remember sitting there watching these people and just thinking to myself, like, what the hell is going on, you know? And because of that, like, that just gave me more of a reason to get out of my house and more of a reason to get away from it all. And my only escape was on the weekends was going to Mondo's house. He would just still come and pick me up and take me to his house. So every weekend I was still going to his house. And after about 2 or 3 months of knowing Mondo, I began to tell Mondo more about myself and more about like my own life and all of these things. And so I tell him, you know, I have a single mother, like I don't have a father, and my mom is now addicted to drugs like crack and cocaine, and she's really mean and she's abusive, and I've got 2 sisters. I'm also bullied at school a lot. I get made fun of and picked on at school, but I'm also a straight A student. Like, I was also a perfect student at school. And as I'm telling Mondo all these problems that I had with my life and all these challenges that I was going through, he was helping me like kind of navigate and understand a lot of these things. But he also began to basically reiterate the same things about his own life to me, where he grew up with a single mother. His mother was very abusive and violent towards him. He also had a few sisters, and he was like the black sheep of the family. Like, everybody hated him for some reason. And, you know, I began to tell Mondo that I was depressed and that I had these like suicidal ideations. And Mondo would tell me the same thing. Like, he had depression and he was always thinking about killing himself. And so Mondo quickly became the only person in my life who I had ever known who could relate to me at any capacity, who had gone through any kind of trouble or adversity or challenges in his life. And so Mondo was my best friend. He became my best friend in a heartbeat. You know, I was 10, 11 years old. He was 30, 31 years old. And we were just best friends from that point forward. We had this like trauma bond of these things that we had experienced together as children. And he was helping me get through all of this. And he was coaching me and navigating and just trying to help me get through all these things. And during this time, he began to tell me certain things that would really shape our relationship, for lack of a better word. He would start to tell me that I was the only thing that mattered to him, and that as long as I didn't kill myself, he wouldn't kill himself, and as long as I stuck around, you know, he wouldn't take his own life. And, you know, and he began to tell me that a little bit deeper feelings. So he began to tell me that he loved me and that he really cared about me. And, you know, initially I didn't take it as any kind of weird way. I just thought that it was like a friend who cared and loved me, like, it just cared about me. So I didn't think anything of it initially. But after knowing Mondo for a few months and after telling him all of those things, I was up at his house one weekend and Jacob was with us. And Jacob sometimes he'd be there, sometimes he wouldn't be. But on this weekend, Jacob was there. And on Sunday, Jacob was going to go get some tacos for us. And Mondo and I stayed at the house and we were watching football. Well, I was cold. And so I tell Mondo, like, hey, you know, I'm cold. Do you have another blanket that I can use? Because Mondo was sitting in his chair by himself and he was covered up with his blanket. And he just tells me, he says, well, why don't you come to get in my lap? So I go and I climb up in Mondo's lap. I'm sitting on his left leg. He's got his left hand on my left hip. And I'm sitting there on his lap and I'm like laid down and he's got his arm around me. And I'm just like nice and warm and I was comfortable. And I had never felt like the embrace or hug or love of another man before, like especially not in this way. So it felt good to me. Like I'd never been held or hugged or loved by my father. So this felt good to be laying on this guy's lap and for him to be holding me and caring about me. It felt right. It felt good. I was comfortable. And so I laid there and we were watching football. and his left hand's on my left hip, and his hand falls off and hits my butt. And he apologizes. He says, "I'm sorry, my bad." I said, "It's not a big deal. I just figured like if I bump somebody in the hallway, you might turn and say, 'Sorry, I didn't mean to bump into you.'" That's all I took it for. And so he picks his hand up and he puts it back on my left hip, and he says to me, "So this is okay." And right when he says that, I already know what's going on. My mind already knows what's happening, but for some reason, I can't stop it, and I freeze up. And I just say, "It's okay." To me, it kind of felt like I was at the top of a roller coaster, and the final click had just hit, and I was about to go down this ride that I didn't want to be on, but I was already strapped in, and so I couldn't get out. That's just how it felt. And so I didn't say anything. I froze up, and he holds his hand on my butt while we're sitting there. A few minutes later, I can hear the gravel turning outside, and it's Jacob pulling back in. So Mondo moves his hand out of the way. Jacob walks in the house, and we sit there, we eat tacos, and then we end up going home. When I get home, I kind of gaslight myself, and I'm telling myself like that didn't happen. This isn't real, or like it's not a big deal, or he didn't mean anything by it, or it's not strange. You're lying to yourself about what just occurred in order to like cope or handle or deal with it. And that's what I was doing. I started to do that. Despite him kind of touching me and doing what he had done, I would continue going to his house. I would continue showing up every weekend, and things would just slowly but surely get out of hand every weekend. It was just a slow burn, like steady progression of him abusing me. I keep going to his house, and then when I would get there, initially when I started hanging out with him, like 80-90% of the time it was video games and movies and fun and relaxation. And over the course of the next few years, it slowly transitioned to like 80% of the time it was video games, and the other 20% it was spending time with Mondo alone or whatever. And then it would just slowly like 70-30, and then 60-40, and then like by the time within maybe 6 months, when I would show up to his house, he would immediately go lay down in his bed, and he would talk about how depressed he was. And so he would go back there and he'd lay down in his bed, and then he would punch the wall behind him. And I remember the first time this happened, I was out there playing video games, and I heard him laying down. He would always tell me he had migraines or he was depressed and that he needed to go sleep. So he would go back in his bed and he would lay there and he would punch the wall behind him. And I'm out there playing video games, and I hear him punching the wall. And so I kind of wonder what's going on. So I go back there and I check on him. I'm like, "Hey, what's going on back here? Like, are you okay?" And he's like, "No, I'm not okay. Like, I just want to die. I just want to kill myself, whatever." And me being this like a caring young child, I sit back there with him, and I'm like trying to help him out and trying to talk him out of it and trying to lift his spirits. And in doing so, he would eventually pull me into the bed, and I would lay there with him in his bed, and then he would begin to tell me more things about how much he loved me, how much he cared about me, and how important I was to him. But during those moments is when he would really begin to start to sexually abuse me. And he would start to slowly, put his hands in my pants, or slowly just kind of touch my body and talk to me and tell me he loved me and kind of say these weird things to me. And I'll never forget like what his hands feel like in those moments. I'll never forget what he smelled like. He always smelled like Old Spice kind of body wash. And his hands were really big and rough. So he had like really big hands. His hands were very calloused. His calluses were very like rough, and just like they would scratch you to the touch. They were so rough. He had long nails. very like calloused, rough knuckles as well, to the point where he would like rub his knuckles against his hands or rub his knuckles together, and it would sound like you're rubbing two rocks together. So he had these just like massive hands that were just rough and uncomfortable, I guess. And so I'll never forget what they feel like, because he would touch me, and I can remember like feeling his scratchy, like calloused palms on my skin, on my bare skin. And over the course of time, he would eventually go from like one or two or three fingers in my waistband to his whole hand in my pants. And then it just became, at some point, it became completely normal for me to go to his house, sit in his lap, and him just put his hand in my pants. Like, it was just completely normal. And the more things got comfortable for him, the more daring and pushing he became. One weekend I was up at his house, and he kind of calls me over to sit in his lap. And as I go to sit in his lap, he leans forward and he grabs me by my shorts and he rips my shorts down. My shorts and my underwear come straight down to my ankles. And I bend down and I pick him up, and I just start crying my eyes out. I'm like super embarrassed and ashamed. And as I'm crying, he pulls me in to his lap and he's holding me and he's hugging me and he's like, "Hey, what's wrong? Like, what's wrong? I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt your feelings. I didn't mean to upset you." And I'm just crying, and I tell him like that was embarrassing. Like, I didn't want you to see me like that. I don't want to be naked in front of you, whatever. And he tells me that I have nothing to be afraid of. I have nothing to be ashamed of or embarrassed about, that everything's okay, and that he loves me and that he didn't mean to hurt me and that he was so sorry. And this is like a very strong manipulative tactic that people do to hurt people. And so he had basically, understanding that he was the only person there that could save me or help me, he violates me, and then he knows that I have to turn to him. There's nobody else that I can turn to. So he violates me by ripping my shorts down, and then he pulls me in and proceeds to love. We would call this love bombing, right? So he tells me that he's so sorry and that he loves me and that there's nothing to be embarrassed about, and praise me with all this love and affection afterwards. And so my mind is just like very confused and just trying to like figure it all out. And at 10 years old, 11 years old, like, you just can't defend yourself against psychological torment. It's just impossible. It's very hard to do it as an adult, but especially at 10, 11 years old, like, you just can't do it. And so I got back into his lap, and life goes on, things just keep happening. He would eventually move on to attempting to use his fingers on me. So, I can remember hearing the jar of Vaseline that sat next to his bed. I can remember hearing the lid pop. I know what the popping sound is like. I remember seeing that jar of Vaseline and seeing the deep scoops in the Vaseline from where he would use his fingers on me. And when he first started doing this, when he first attempted to do it, I would always resist it and I always hated it, and I never wanted to do it. But after a while, it becomes easier to just feed the beast, so to speak, than it does to just constantly resist it. Because when I would resist it, he would go into this like super depressive and like pathetic state of, I hate myself and my life is horrible and like you're the only thing that matters to me. So he would kind of do all those things to guilt me into letting him do things to me. And the first time he tried to use his fingers on me, it was hurting so bad, and he's asking me, he's like, "Well, what's wrong?" I kept saying like, "Ow," and "Stop," and "Please don't do that." And he asked me, "Well, what's wrong?" And I said, "Your nails hurt really bad," because he had these very long, big nails. So in an effort to satisfy his sick and twisted desires, the next weekend I go back to his house, his nails were gone. So he had completely clipped or removed his nails so that he could use his fingers on me. So I didn't really have an excuse for him to not violate me in that way anymore. And so that happened. keep in mind, while all this was going on the weekends, every Monday, every week, Monday through Friday, I was going home to an abusive mother, addicted to crack cocaine, right? So things were, I was living in this world where things were just, they were just, it didn't matter where I was going, I was being abused or violated or traumatized, or there was just, I was escaping one hell to go to another. And about 12 and a half years old, I had been sexually abused now for about 2.5 years. And I had experienced pretty much everything you can experience in the realm of sexual abuse. Mondo at this point had violated my body with his fingers. He had performed oral sex on me and also had convinced me to reiterate or reciprocate the oral sex and perform it on him. And at this point, 2.5 years in, this was happening like every single weekend. Every time I'd go to his house, like all of these things would happen every time. And I just didn't know how to escape. I didn't know how to get out of it. I didn't know what to do. I was terrified. I hated going there. I hated being there. I hated all of the mental stress and the toll and the psychological like abuse that he would do to me. So even if I didn't want to go, or if I wanted to do something else on the weekend, or even when I got there, if I didn't want to do something, he would just go into this manipulative state and convince me to do whatever it is that we were going to do. So I couldn't escape. I was lost and scared and alone. And when I was about 12 and a half years old, I came home from his house one weekend on a Sunday, and my sisters were at my neighbor's house watching a show called Intervention. So I go in the house, and they were never really over there, which is what kind of piqued my interest. And so I walk in, I see they're watching this TV show. And for those of you who don't know, Intervention is about, a family has an addicted family member, and so they set up this surprise intervention to help get them off of drugs and help turn their life around. And I walk in, I see they're watching this TV show. I'd never seen it before, and it kind of piqued my interest, and so we're sitting there watching it. And at the end of every episode, they always put their contact information, their phone number and email address, or like a shipping address where you can write them a letter or whatever. And my sisters and I kind of look at each other and we're like, hey, like, we should try and get mom some help. Like, maybe these guys will come out and help out mom, And whatever, like, we're kind of talking about it. My younger sister walks outside. She goes to leave to go back home. And my older sister and I are sitting in there talking about it. And then my younger sister walks back in and is screaming and crying, like just hysterical. And my older sister and I are like, what the hell's going on, So we go outside, and there's a fire in our front yard. And my mom's boyfriend walks out of the front door. He's got a white tank top on, and he's covered in blood. My mom then comes out, and she's yelling and screaming, and she's like storming around the yard, and just like there's like this whole like violent scene ensuing right in front of me at 12 years old. And I'm just kind of like watching it all happen, and I break down into tears, and I fall apart, and I'm just on the floor just screaming and crying because I know that my mother is about to be taken away from me. And I just couldn't believe what was happening right in front of me. So cop pulls up, he throws my mom in the back of the car, and all I can remember from that point forward was standing in the road looking at my mom in the back of this car, like screaming and crying and begging to have her back, and she's in the back of the cop car, and she's looking up at me, and she's kind of just telling me like, I love you, it's going to be okay, I'm going to get you back, all of these things. And the cop comes in and gets in the car, and he takes her away. Then I go back inside, and there's a cop in there. There's another police officer with my sisters, and like random members of my family showed up. I have no idea how they were contacted or who called them or what, but we just had like random family members show up out of nowhere, to include my father. And the cop in there was like, hey, what are we going to do with the kids? And so we all go to my father's house initially, and I move in with my father about 45 minutes away in a town called Salina, Ohio. Well, Salina is a very small town, very homegrown kind of place where everybody knows everybody. And coming from Lima to Salina was a massive culture shock and shift. It's just a completely different environment. Lima being a very diverse and, you know, just a very diverse, a lot of different cultures, and like an inner city feel to Salina being a country school where everybody knows everybody. Everybody's grown up with everybody out there, and everybody's, got it all good basically. So it seemed, um, yeah, it was very hard for me to fit in out there, and I was struggling obviously with everything that was going on with my mother, but then also being sexually abused as well. Like I was just like struggling to kind of survive and cope with life, and so at that school in particular, I was very, you know, I was misbehaving and just kind of being very bad and being violent. I ended up putting my hands on the principal. And so they sent me to alternative school, and they told me that if I got in trouble again, they were going to send me to juvie. So I tell my dad, like, hey, I can't stay here. I got to go back home. I got to go back to Lima and live with somebody else where I'm more comfortable and where I can get along with these people. So I go back to Lima and I live with my cousins for maybe a month or two. And then they tell me, like, hey, we're having a baby. You can't stay with us. So I leave their house and I go live at another kind of random person's house. I'm sleeping on their couch basically. And after a few weeks of that, I'm bouncing around, a couple more times, and I end up at this house with this family. It's a mother and a father, and they have a couple kids of their own, and then they're like a typical middle class family, like a typical middle class America family. And I was really excited to live with them because um, I had like I guess new brother and sister you could say because I was by myself at this point. So I moved in with them. I was kind of like living with these people that had just their own kids and they were like a normal family. They had food and water and heat every day, And so when I was living with them, um, I was excited because I just thought that I had somebody to take care of me finally, like a place where I could live and be. And during that time, I was still going to see Mondo every weekend. Um, but it had been like 2 or 3 weekends in a row where I did not go and see him. And so Mondo, I'm on the phone with him one weekend and he says like, hey Seth, why aren't you coming to see me anymore? It had been like 2 or 3 weeks in a row, which was very rare for me to not go to his house. And I told him, I said, well, I got this family now and I got these people I live with. Like, I don't need you anymore. I don't need you as much. And when I told him that, he went into this, once again, this very manipulative and like depressive, pathetic state of like, what do you mean you don't need me? And, what am I going to do without you? And like all of these things. And at that time, I just wanted to go and live my life. Like, I just wanted to be a kid and be alone and like do my thing. And I couldn't say any of those things to him. I just folded and I said, okay, like I'll be back there next weekend. So, you know, where I go back to his house and the abuse continues. Well, one day when I was back at home living with these people, I get a phone call and it's from my mother. And my mother, get on the phone and I'm hello, hey, this is your mom. And I'm kind of talking to her for a second. And then she says, where are you at? Because I'm going to come and get you. I'm going to come and get you now. And I said, well, mom, like, I don't want to live with you anymore. And that was one of the hardest things I ever had to do as a child at 12 years old was tell my mom, like, I don't want to come and live with you again. Like, I don't want to go wherever you're going. I don't want to be with you. That was very difficult, very hard to do. And I cried. And what made it even worse was instead of her saying, I love you, or hey, I'm sorry, I'm doing better now, like, instead of her coming at it with compassion and love again, she proceeds to yell and scream at me on the phone and saying, you're my fucking son. You're my responsibility. I'm going to come and get you. Like, fuck this, fuck that. I'm coming to get you. And I was terrified because I did not want to live with her anymore. And I knew that I just told her this, so she's going to be mad at me. She's going to be angry with me. And so I was terrified. I just didn't want to see her. I was scared. And the people that I lived with, they were not related to me. They had no influence, I guess, in that realm. But they had asked to adopt me, and I said yes, like please do, because I don't want to go back and live with my mom. And um, in that conversation, at some point, my grandparents were called because those people would have a hard time trying to adopt me. So my grandparents get contacted, and I go to my grandparents' house. And when my grandparents picked me up, I go to their home, and my sisters were actually already there, which was a surprise to me because I had not seen my sisters in 3 or 4 or 5, 6 months, something like that. It'd been a long time. So I got there, and once again, I had this moment of like, hey, everything's okay now. Everything's gonna be okay because we were living with grandma and grandpa. Grandma and grandpa had money. They had nice things. You know, my grandpa retired from Ford. My grandma ran her own business, and so they had nice cars, a nice house, a pool in the backyard. Like, I just thought that everything was gonna be perfect finally. You know, I thought everything was gonna be good to go now. Um, After about 2 or 3 weeks of living there, my mom, she had continued to call my sisters, and she had manipulated and convinced my sisters to leave my grandparents' house. And so my sisters leave my grandparents, they go back and live with my mom, and I stayed there. And I asked my grandparents to adopt me, and so that process had started. Well, after a few weeks of living there, um, I'm on the phone with Mondo, and Mondo's asking me like, when am I going to come back to his house? And so I said, well, and I got to ask my grandparents, and I don't know what they're going to say, and this and that. And so Mondo basically coaches me into convincing my grandparents that he's okay and that I should go back to his house. So I tell my grandparents I have this friend that I want to hang out with, and they ask who it is. I tell them who it is, and they're immediately like, nope, we're not doing this. Like, you're not hanging out with an adult. That's weird. Um, and so I'm like, no, he's not like that. Like, Jacob knows him, and my grandparents knew who Jacob was. And so I'm like, hey, like, he's good. Like, don't, he's not weird. He's not strange. And so they're like, well, we want to meet him. So Mondo comes to my house, and he meets my grandparents, and he makes them laugh and smile, and he's good to go now. Like, he's in the house. He tells them like, yeah, I know Seth has had a hard time growing up, and we're just kind of friends, and we play video games, and we hang out, and all these things. So um, Mondo's kind of back in the saddle, right? He's back with my grandparents, and the abuse continues. Okay, so fortunately enough for me, now my Monday through Friday was no longer in this house of drugs and violence and abuse. I was at least with people who cared about me enough to love me and feed me and do all the right things, which were my grandparents. They took very good care of me, but on the weekends, the sexual abuse got worse and worse and worse from this point forward. And around 13 years old, I was up at his house one weekend, and he was kind of doing the thing where he's punching the wall. And so I go back there, and whenever he would punch the wall, my stomach would drop, and I would just sit out there, and I would just, because that was him like ringing his dinner bell. It's basically him telling me that, hey, it's time. Like, I'm ready for you, so come on back here. And I'm out there playing video games, and I would just hear him punching the wall, and my stomach would drop. And the longer that I would make him wait or that I would resist, the more intense it would get. He would punch harder and faster, and he would like do these exhaustive like moans and groans, and just he was just guilt tripping me, and it just felt like you're being like pulled into hell basically when he would do that. I mean, it felt truly like there was like a chain attached to me, and that he was just slowly pulling me in with his chain back into his lair, so to speak. And I go back there, but this time was a little bit different. It was a little strange. He was like sitting up, and he kind of grabs me, and he pulls me towards him, and then he stands up, and he kind of motions himself behind me, and he pushes me into the bed. And I'm walking forward, kind of taking little short choppy steps, and my knees hit the mattress. My knees hit the edge of the mattress, and he pushes me into the mattress. And so I fall to my knees basically, and I'm on my hands and my knees, and I can hear once again the Vaseline jar pop open. I can hear him take a scoop out with his fingers, and then I feel his hand on my hip and on my back as one hand's kind of holding me still, and the other hand proceeds to put the Vaseline on my body. For the last 3 years, I had resisted this, right? He had attempted this multiple times, and I had resisted it every time and told him no, and I don't want to do this, and please stop, and it hurts, and this and that. And I had fought it all for so long, but for some reason, I couldn't do it anymore. It was too much. It was exhausting. I was terrified. I was scared. And I just sat there and I froze up. And I was stiff as a board. And I feel his other hand kind of grab a hold of my hip. And I can feel his legs kind of touching my feet and kind of pushing my feet to the side. And he began to rape me. I was 13 years old when that happened. After a few moments, he's done. He gets a towel out and he wipes me up with this towel. He cleans me up. I get up and I walk to the bathroom and I'm sitting on his toilet and I'm just crying. I am getting everything out of my body. I've got my hands covering up my face is kind of sitting in my hands, and I'm just crying silently to myself because I don't have a mother, I don't have a father, I've been abused, I've been neglected, and all of these horrible things have happened to me. I don't have any friends, and now I have just been raped after being sexually abused by this man for the last 3 years, and now he's finally raped me. And so I'm just sitting there crying and just not understanding why this was happening to me or why I had to be the one to go through all these things. And at this point, I definitely couldn't report the man anymore. That's how I felt. I felt like I couldn't tell anybody what happened to me, because if I report him, not only am I telling on him, but I'm telling on myself. Like, I'm telling other people that these things happened to me and that I was complicit in a way. Like, I allowed him to just do this to me. So I was so scared of people finding out that this has happened to me. I was terrified of people finding out and thinking that, maybe Seth was gay, or maybe Seth has HIV or AIDS or some sort of disease, or all these other horrible things that kids would say or make fun of me for. Like, I was just terrified of all of those things. I was scared of all of the adult friends that we had, and like all of my family and my friends' families and everybody that knew him. Like, I was scared of rejection and denial. And so I just bottled it all up. I took a shower. I walked out of his bathroom. I put a smile on and I kept playing the game. And a couple years had gone by, a couple more years go by, and I'm up at his house again on a weekend. And I'm up there with a younger friend of mine. And this younger kid, he was having a bad day. And so Mondo says to him, verbatim, if you're having a bad day, I can take you back in the bed and I can blow you. Now, what makes that comment so striking and powerful is the fact that he would say that same thing to me. He would say those same things, make those same kind of comments to me in front of other adults that we would hang out with over the last 5.5 years or so. Whenever we were at somebody else's house, hanging out, playing games, watching football or whatever, and it was time to leave, he would say that very thing to me in front of other adults, or he would tell other adults that it was time to leave so that Seth could blow him that night, or he could go and perform whatever acts he wanted to perform on me. And most people, shake their heads when I say that, and they say, man, I couldn't imagine, I couldn't believe he would say that in front of other adults. And he did. And he would say it often. And this is just another manipulative tactic to prove to the abusee, like me, that there's nothing I can do about this. I am openly admitting to hurting you in front of other people, and they are not going to step in. They're not going to protect you. They're not going to intervene. Therefore, if you say anything, you try to report him or you try to do whatever, like nobody's going to believe you because I am telling these people what I'm doing to you, and they're still not saying anything. So that's what he would do, and he would just say it in front of other people whenever it was time to leave. Hey, I got to go back so Seth can blow me tonight, and everybody would just laugh it off. And meanwhile, I'm just thinking to myself like, why is nobody trying to help me or protect me, or why is nobody standing up for me, or saying that's wrong or questioning anything, you know? So when he made that comment towards my friend, to me that had crossed the line, and I didn't want to see my friend go through the things that I had gone through. So when he initially says it to my friend, we all laugh it off and we just kind of like ignore it or whatever. But shortly thereafter, Mondo goes back and lays in his bed, and then he calls my friend back there with him. And they're back there for a few minutes. I don't think anything happened, or I don't know, but maybe after a few minutes, Mondo comes out of the room, and he's like agitated and visibly upset. And while he was back there, I was playing video games, and I was actually playing a video game with Jacob online. So he was in college, and I'm playing with him online. And I messaged Jacob on the game, and I said, hey, I need to talk to you on Sunday. Can you please come to my house? And he says, yep, got it. And that's all he says. Doesn't say anything else. Boom. That was the last message. So Mondo comes out of his room, and the rest of the night goes on. Don't really remember much from that night. I don't know if it was that night, or excuse me, I don't really remember much from that night. But the next night was a Saturday night, and once again, Mondo violates me. He rapes me again at 15. I was almost 16 years old. I was about a month away from being 16, and he would do this to me too while my friend was just in the other room, like literally just 10, 15 feet away, and he would just abuse me while I was back there in his bed with him. And so that weekend he rapes me again. Sunday rolls around, and it was time to go home. So Mondo takes us home. He drops me off first, and he goes and drops off my younger friend who lives further in the city. And shortly after getting home, Jacob shows up at my house, and we're walking around and we're talking. And me and Jacob end up in my bedroom, and he's like, hey, so what's going on? Like, what do you want to talk about? And I start pacing in my bedroom, and I start walking back and forth, and I'm just like going back and forth, and I'm scared, and I'm like panicking, and I'm just telling Jacob like, hey, I've been wanting to tell you this for a long time. I don't know how to say this. I don't know, I don't want you to be mad at me. I don't want you to be upset with me. I don't know what to do. And I'm just kind of going back and forth. And I can't say the words. I cannot verbalize what I need to tell him. And so Jacob breaks the silence, and he says, Mondo touched you, didn't he? And as soon as he says that, I fall to my knees. I'm on my hands and knees in my bedroom, and I'm just screaming and crying and punching the floor. And the answer is obviously yes, right? So after a few moments, Jacob breaks the silence again. He says, well, he did it to me too. And I turn and look at Jacob, and I can't believe it. I am completely blown away because Jacob was like my role model, my idol, my hero. Like he was everything that a young boy needs, and another like man, I guess you could say. I mean, Jacob was in college. He was hanging out with all the girls. He was like doing all the cool things. I mean, I absolutely loved him and looked up to him and admired him for everything that he was and that he did. And so the last thing I was expecting was him to say that, and I just couldn't believe it. I didn't believe it, or that was the last thing I was expecting, And so he says again, well, what do you want to do about it? Do you want to report him, or do you want to keep it a secret? And I tell Jacob, I said, nope, like we got to report him because he's about to start doing it to my younger friend, and I can't let that happen. And so we go out in the living room, and we sit down with my grandma and grandpa, and my grandma's kind of like already wondering what's going on because I have a flushed face. I'm all red. My eyes are swollen from crying. And I can't say it again. I cannot talk or verbalize it or say what I need to say. And so Jacob breaks the silence again. He says, "It's Mondo." And as soon as he says that, my grandma just falls apart and starts crying. I can hear her from the other side of the room, even today, saying, like, my baby, as she's crying. And I go over there and I give her a hug. And I'm apologizing because, like, I let this guy in the house and I defended him and I protected him and all of these things, right? So we end up calling the police, and the police tell us to go down to the hospital. So we go down to the hospital. We get there, get up in the nurse's office, and the nurses are kind of talking to us, asking questions. And one of the nurses comes in and says, Seth, she says, "Do you have any dirty clothes that you've worn to his house recently? Or, do you have anything that hasn't been washed or anything like that?" And I tell the nurse, I said, "Well, he just raped me about 12 hours ago, and I haven't taken a shower and I haven't changed my clothes." And I remember the nurse getting down on a knee, and she put her hand on my leg and she looked at me and she said, "You are so powerful. You are incredible." And she said, "Seth, like, that's amazing." And she says, "Do you mind if we take your clothes off and test them and test you as well?" And the silence in the room at that time was like deafening because everybody was blown away at what I had done at just 15 years old. Despite what had happened to me, I was able to maintain the situational awareness to not take a shower, to not change my clothes, and to keep everything on me. And so they were very impressed and very proud of me for that. And that moment was really, really powerful. And so they take my clothes and they test them and they test my body. I do the whole rape kit situation. And, a few minutes later, this police officer walks in and I see his last name is Couples. And when he walks in, I'm like thinking to myself, like Couples. And I'm like, "Hey, is your wife, Mrs. Couples?" And he says, "Yes, like that's my wife." And so his wife was actually my teacher a few years prior. And I recognize this man because he was a veteran from Iraq and Afghanistan. And so on Veterans Day and Memorial Days, things like that, my teacher, his wife, would bring him in to talk to the class and just kind of like about the Army and about Afghanistan and all that stuff. And so I had already known this guy. Coincidentally enough, like the guy that walked in to handle my case, I had already met him a couple times, and I already had this like familiarity with him, or this rapport with him, which is really, really cool. And come to find out, his name is Chad Couples. He was a police officer from Bluffton, Ohio. And Chad sits down with me and he tells me, "Seth," he says, "the more you tell me now, the less we'll have to do later." And so I proceed to tell this man, for the first time I'd ever talked about anything ever about this in my life. I sit down with Chad and I tell him all of the most horrific moments that happened to me as over the last almost 6 years that this man was sexually abusing me every weekend. And I'm telling Chad some pretty rough stories, some pretty tough moments in my life. A lot of things that you just couldn't imagine somebody doing to a child. And after we're all done, Chad's like, "Hey, good job. Like, you're incredible. Great work." And Chad leaves the hospital. He drives up to Bluffton, Ohio, where he eventually finds Mondo and asks Mondo to come down to the station with him. And he gets a out of custody confession from Mondo. That same day, I just left the hospital and went home. I never saw like a crime victim services. I was never assigned any kind of therapy or psychologist or therapist or whatever. I just went home and continued living my life. I turned 16 about a month later, and I got my braces off. I was going to the fairgrounds. I was hanging out with my friends now. It had no like immediate impact on me. I wasn't, super depressed and wanting to die or anything like that. I was fine. Like I just reported him and just moved on with my life. I didn't think anything of it. I didn't go through any kind of treatment or therapy or nothing. I found out a few months later that Mondo was charged with like 10 or 11 felony counts of misconduct, things like that. And then shortly thereafter that, I found out that they offered him a plea deal. And so he took 4 of the counts and he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. And that was back in 2011. So he would be free today. But fortunately enough, he died in 2019 in prison. So after abusing me and Jacob for about 10 years between the two of us, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison, which obviously, I don't think anybody would call that justice, but I did get something out of it, which I'm thankful for, being able to at least put him away so he couldn't continue abusing people. Since that day of reporting him, I have gone on and had the opportunities and like privilege to do some pretty incredible things with my life, things that I'm very proud of, and I'm fortunate to be here and to be the man that I am today, despite everything that I've gone through. But I wouldn't be here without all of the people that have helped me along the way. I've had teachers and coaches and police officers and all of those things. And I eventually, after reporting him, I joined the Army. I served in the military for about 9 years. And I was in the Army, I was in the infantry, I was in the 82nd Airborne Division in Fort Bragg, North Carolina. During my time in the military, I would meet my now wife. So we've been married now for almost 8 years, and in the military, we had our first 2 children, and now we have a third one on the way. That'll be here in a few months. Served the military for 9 years, met my wife, had a couple kids, got out, and then I got into the construction industry. In the construction industry, I was building houses, and I was very good at my job. Although I never had a degree or never had any experience in construction, I did very well, climbed to the top of the leaderboards at this company. I was number 1 in the country for like 18 months in a row or something crazy. I was just crushing it in my professional career, making a ton of money, doing all the right things. But during that time, I was just pushing my family away because my whole life I wanted this like perfect life, this family, white picket fence, the dog. Like I wanted all of these things. And as soon as I got it, it just felt out of place because of everything that I had gone through. I wanted the uncomfortable pain and suffering again. And so I would just act the ways that I would act as a kid, or the ways that were forced upon me, like these manipulative and abusive behaviors. I began to act like that as a man towards people in my life. My wife, I wasn't very good to her for a very long time. People that I worked with, customers. I mean, literally everybody in my life, I was in this like manipulative state, just trying to control everything and everybody because of what had happened to me for so long. And I was living in this victimhood and I was perpetuating all of the trauma that I had gone through right into my own life for a very long time. I've since grown out of those things, right? So I've since grown out of those things. I finally made a decision to change, and I finally made the decision that like I didn't want to live this horrible life anymore, and this like disturbing and just insufferable, like miserable person. I didn't want to be that person anymore. And so I made the decision to start living my life in a better way and to start becoming a better, like more positive, happier person. And that takes every single day waking up and recognizing that like I'm going to win, I'm going to accomplish things, I'm going to be a good person today, I'm going to do good things today, I'm going to be the best husband that I can be, the best father, the best employee, the best whatever it is that I'm doing. I'm trying to be the best at it, and so that's helped me a lot with my mentality. Was like I had to make a decision that I wanted to be better, and then I had to work on it every single day like it was like a skill, like a practice to be happy. And at the moment, I'm the happiest I've ever been in my entire life with everything that's going on. Over the last couple of years, I've trained and competed in jiu-jitsu, and I still do that now today. I went and ran a bunch of ultra marathons. I ran like 7 ultra marathons in the span of 9 months, to include a 100-mile race. And these were all like opportunities of ways to challenge myself and to kind of push myself into this uncomfortable place so that I can grow and learn and heal from it, and which I've done. I eventually ended up writing a book. So this is my book. It's titled Strength Beyond the Shadows: Overcoming a Childhood of Trauma, Neglect, and Sexual Abuse. I wrote this book in 2024, published it in December of 2024. This is available now on Amazon. I'll put the link below. But yeah, I mean, after everything that I've gone through, I'm a motivational speaker now. I travel and I speak and I share my story with different communities and different events and things like that, different kind of conferences and stuff. After everything I've gone through, I'm now a motivational speaker, author, ultra marathon runner, jiu-jitsu athlete, father, husband. I'm all of these things, all of these like positive things, and I've built this identity on all these positive things instead of all of the negative things that I've gone through, right? So I don't look at myself like a survivor or a victim or a traumatized individual or some other kind of like mental health diagnosis or personality disorder. I don't carry any of those labels. If people ever ask me who I am or what I do, I'm never any of those things. I've gone through those things and I've experienced those things, but that's not who I am, and that's not my identity. That's not my, like, none of those things are valuable to me in that regard. I went and built my own identity as a combat veteran, as an author, speaker, ultra runner, jiu-jitsu athlete, husband, father. I went and had to build my own identity with all of these positive things, almost like rebranding in a way. And that's what's helped me like climb out of this hell that I lived in for so long, as a child, but even as an adult. Even as an adult, I perpetuated, like I said, all of the things that I had gone through. In the military, I treated people like shit. I was a horrible leader. I just did not do the right things, and I was lost and depressed and suicidal and just hanging on to life by a thread. And my marriage was the same way. And then in my professional career, it was the same way. I was accomplishing things. I was winning and I was getting all this external validation for all the good things that I was doing, but it was never enough. And so I just continued to make it worse and worse and worse until eventually it all came to a point where I was so exhausted and tired of living in complete misery that I made the decision that I'm no longer living like this. And over the last year and a half or so, I've completely turned my life around with this mentality of, I'm not going to be this person. I'm not going to be this miserable person. I'm going to go on and do bigger and better and great things with my life. So, yeah, that is my story in a nutshell. It's hard to cover 30 years of life in a single video. It's hard to cover it in a book. It's hard to cover it, period. So I've started documenting it, putting it on YouTube and TikTok and Instagram, and speaking on stages and conferences. And through all of these things, I'll eventually get the word out there to enough people. But it's all about making an impact. I tell my story so people don't feel alone. People don't feel lost, and understand that like there's always hope. There's always a place that you can go to. There's always a place that wants you and loves you and cares for you. No matter what you've been through, there's somebody out there, there's somewhere out there to go, someone to go to, and there's something that you can do about whatever situation you're in. You don't have to live the way that you've been living. You don't have to live this life. So with all that being said, thank you all for watching. If anybody's interested in reaching out, I'm available on all the social media platforms. You can just kind of look up my name and find me. You can DM me or send me an email. Yeah, that's my story. So thank you all for watching.